The mountain had never asked Elijah Crow for love, only endurance. And for nearly 40 years he had given it exactly that. Day after quiet day, season after brutal season, living alone in a hand-built cabin where the pine trees leaned, close like silent witnesses, and the snow came early and stayed late, teaching him that warmth was something earned, not expected. Elijah was known in the valley below as the Mountain Man, a name spoken with equal parts respect and distance, a man whose shoulders were shaped by axes and winters, whose voice had grown unused to conversation, and whose heart, if anyone bothered to think of it at all, was assumed to be as hard as the granite ridges above his home. When the letter arrived, creased and smelling faintly of ink and dust, offering a marriage arranged through necessity rather than romance, Elijah accepted it with the same practicality he accepted storms, because loneliness had begun to echo louder than the wind at night, and the idea of a woman sharing his roof felt less like hope and more like a solution. He expected a cold marriage because that was all he believed he could offer: food, shelter, safety, silence. The woman, according to the sparse description, was widowed, quiet, accustomed to hardship, and willing to come to the mountains for a life that promised little softness. Elijah folded the letter, placed it in the pocket of his wool coat, and told himself this arrangement would be fair, even if it was never warm. On the morning she was to arrive, the mountain woke under a pale sky, frost clinging to the edges of the world, and Elijah stood outside his cabin longer than usual, listening for a sound he hadn't listened for in years, another human presence. He told himself not to expect much, not to imagine conversation by the fire or laughter echoing off the beams, because expectation had a way of becoming disappointment, and disappointment had no place in a life built on survival. When the wagon finally appeared on the narrow trail, Elijah's first thought was that it looked too small for such a long journey, and his second was that the woman stepping down from it did not look at all like what he had imagined. She was slight but steady, her dress worn but clean, her dark hair pinned neatly despite the long ride, and when she lifted her eyes to meet his, there was no fear in them, only a calm awareness that felt unsettling in a way Elijah could not immediately name. She introduced herself simply, her voice soft but sure, and thanked him for meeting her, as if this was a kindness rather than an obligation. And Elijah found himself nodding, words caught somewhere between his chest and his throat, unused to forming sentences meant for another person. As they walked toward the cabin, he explained the rules of mountain life, the way one might explain the weather, where the water was drawn, how the fire was kept, which trails were safe and which could turn deadly, without warning, and she listened without interrupting, absorbing every detail, as if she had always known this was where she would end up. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled low, the space tidy but bare, and Elijah gestured to the small room that would be hers, stating plainly that he expected no more from her than shared work and shared space. No illusions of romance, no promises he could not keep. She surprised him by smiling, not brightly, not foolishly, but with a quiet understanding that seemed to settle into the room like warmth, and said she had not come seeking fairy tales, only a place to belong and a man who kept his word. That night, as the mountain darkened and the wind pressed against the cabin walls, Elijah lay awake, listening to unfamiliar sounds, soft footsteps, the careful closing of a door, the rhythm of another person breathing under his roof. And for the first time in years, the silence did not feel empty. Days followed with a cautious rhythm, two lives learning to move around each other without collision. And Elijah watched her adapt with a competence that unsettled him more than clumsiness would have. She learned the stove quickly, respected the tools, asked questions that showed thought rather than doubt. And when she spoke of her past, she did so without bitterness, acknowledging loss without letting it define her. He told himself not to look for more, not to read meaning into the way she left a mug warming near the fire for him when he returned from the cold, or how she noticed the way his injured shoulder stiffened and adjusted the work without comment. Because this marriage was not meant to change him, it was meant to endure. Yet change came quietly, like snow falling in the night, unnoticed, until the world looked different in the morning. Elijah found himself lingering at the table longer, listening when she spoke, noticing the softness in her laughter when something small amused her, and the strength in her silence when words were unnecessary. One evening, as a storm howled outside and the fire burned low, she asked him about the scar along his jaw, not with curiosity meant to pry, but with a gentleness that made the memory surface before he could stop it. And he told her a story he had never told another soul, his voice rough with disuse and emotion, and she listened without flinching, without trying to fix what could not be fixed. When he finished, she simply thanked him for trusting her, and in that moment, Elijah felt something shift, an unfamiliar warmth spreading through a place he had long believed unreachable. Still, he reminded himself this was temporary, that comfort did not equal love, that mountains did not soften men without cost, and that expecting more would only invite pain. But as the weeks passed, the cabin changed in subtle ways, filled with small signs of care and presence, and Elijah realized with quiet astonishment that he no longer dreaded the long nights, because he was no longer facing them alone. He had expected a cold marriage, a practical arrangement carved from necessity. But as winter settled in and the mountain wrapped itself around them, Elijah began to understand that warmth did not always arrive like fire. It could come like a steady flame, patient and persistent, slowly changing everything it touched. And as this chapter of their life unfolded, one truth became undeniable. The woman who had arrived with nothing but resilience and quiet courage was already changing his heart in ways he had never prepared for. Spring did not arrive all at once on the mountain. It crept in cautiously as if unsure it was welcome, and Elijah Crow noticed the change not in the melting snow or the softening ground, but in himself, in the way he woke before dawn and listened for the quiet sounds of another life moving in the cabin, in the way the silence that once protected him now felt empty when she stepped outside to gather water or hang laundry in the thin sunlight. He had lived most of his life believing solitude was strength, that needing no one was the purest form of survival. Yet the woman who had come into his life under the cold agreement of marriage had quietly dismantled that belief without argument or force, simply by being present, steady and kind. As winter loosened its grip, their days filled with shared labor that felt less like obligation and more like partnership, repairing the fence together, clearing fallen branches, preparing the soil for planting, and Elijah found himself watching her hands as she worked, noticing how capable they were, how gentle even when the task was hard, and something inside him stirred with a mix of admiration and fear, because admiration invited attachment, and attachment was something he had never learned how to survive. She spoke more now, not in long speeches, but in small observations about the mountain, about how beautiful it was when the fog settled low in the mornings, about how lonely it must have been for him all those years before she arrived. And when she said that last part, not accusing, only wondering, Elijah felt something tighten in his chest, because it was the first time anyone had acknowledged that his life, by though strong, had also been painfully quiet. He tried to keep emotional distance, telling himself this marriage had begun out of necessity and should remain practical. But practicality faltered when he noticed how the cabin had changed, the way the table was always set for two, the way the shelves held small touches of care, the way warmth seemed to linger even when the fire burned low, and he realized the change was not in the walls or the furniture, but in him. The turning moment came on a day that should have been ordinary, when Elijah went farther down the mountain trail than usual to check traps, misjudged the softened ground, and fell hard against a hidden rock. The pain sharp and blinding, and for the first time in decades fear surged through him, not because he might die, but because she would be alone if he did. He managed to make it back to the cabin by sheer will, blood soaking into his shirt. And when she saw him collapse at the door, the sound she made was not a scream but a broken gasp, as if something inside her had torn open. She tended to him with calm urgency, cleaning the wound, setting his injured shoulder, speaking softly but firmly, and as he drifted in and out of sleep, Elijah realized no one had ever cared for him like this, not as a duty, not out of obligation, but out of genuine concern. And when he woke later to find her sitting nearby, eyes red from worry, he felt exposed in a way strength had never prepared him for. Recovery forced him into stillness, into allowing himself to be helped, and that helplessness stripped away his usual defenses. He listened as she spoke of her own past, more honestly than ever before, of a marriage that had taught her endurance instead of love, of years spent feeling invisible, of how she had agreed to come to the mountain not because she expected happiness, but because she believed solitude with honesty was better than loneliness in a crowd. Elijah confessed then, voice rough, that he had never expected her to change anything, that he had prepared himself for a life lived side by side, but never truly together. And she answered him not with anger or disappointment, but with a quiet truth that she had not come to be endured, she had come to belong. The words struck him harder than the fall had, because they demanded a choice, and Elijah had spent his life avoiding choices that involved other people. As his strength returned, spring fully claimed the mountain, wildflowers pushing through thawed soil, birds returning to the trees, and with the land awakening, so did the bond between them. They laughed more easily, spoke openly, shared memories by the fire at night. And Elijah began to imagine a future that extended beyond survival, a future that included companionship, shared purpose and warmth that had nothing to do with flames. But the mountain, like life, did not allow peace without testing it. And the test arrived in the form of men from the valley, carrying papers and threats disguised as legality, claiming Elijah's land was no longer his, that progress demanded roads and ownership demanded proof, and faced with the possibility of losing the only home he had ever trusted. Elijah's old instincts surged forward, protect, isolate, endure alone. He told her he would handle it, that she should consider leaving before things grew dangerous, and the hurt in her eyes was sharper than any wound he had suffered. She reminded him that marriage was not a shelter to hide behind when times were calm and abandoned. When storms arrived, that she had chosen this life and him, and that love, once offered, could not be returned to silence. When Elijah finally understood what he was about to lose, not just land, but the woman who had become his heart's anchor, he did something he had never done before. He asked for help, stood beside her instead of ahead of her, and together they faced the threat with quiet resolve. The claim was challenged, the truth uncovered, and the mountain remained theirs. But the real victory came afterward, in the stillness that followed, when Elijah realized that home was no longer defined by isolation or ownership, but by shared presence and chosen commitment. Standing on the ridge as the sun set over the valley, Elijah Crow, the mountain man who once expected a cold marriage and a colder future, turned to the woman who had changed him and understood with absolute clarity that love had not weakened him, it had saved him. And as their story reached its quiet, powerful conclusion, remember this. This story is purely a work of imagination, but the love and emotions that quietly changed a heart were completely real. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to subscribe for more unforgettable stories.